The morning sky was bruised with the purple light of the rising sun, casting long, broken shadows across the dry plains of the Arizona desert. Silas Whitmore, his weathered face lined by the years of labor, stood by the fence of his modest ranch, his hands rough from years of handling the earth. He was alone, as he often was at dawn, the world around him still asleep, save for the rustling of leaves and the low hum of distant wind. And then it came, a scream, not the usual cries of animals or the occasional yelp of a coyote, but the gut-wrenching sound of human terror, pure and unrestrained, like a blade slicing through the quiet morning. Silas froze, his boots shifting on the dry, cracked earth beneath him. The sound cut into him like an uninvited guest, unfamiliar and raw. He dropped the fence post in his hand, the wood hitting the dirt with a hollow thud, and his fingers instinctively reached for his rifle. It had come from the eastern pasture, near the old oak where the property line curved toward Miller's Creek. Silas had worked this land for 8 years, but he knew better than to ignore a scream like that. His heart pounded as he ran, the dry earth kicking up behind him with every heavy step. The sun was creeping over the hills now, casting its golden light across the land, making it seem almost peaceful. But there was no peace in that scream. Another scream rang out, weaker this time, desperate. Silas' gut twisted as he rounded the bend near the creek, his mind racing with every worst-case scenario. As he approached the old oak, he nearly stumbled over his own feet at the sight that greeted him. A young girl, no more than 16, was tied to the fence post, her hands bound with thick rope that was soaked in fresh blood. Her dress, torn and muddied, clung to her frail frame, and her dark hair hung in matted, bloody strands. But it wasn't the dirt or the blood that struck him hardest. It was her eyes, wild, frantic, yet fierce with an anger that spoke of a will to survive, a fire that wouldn't be extinguished. For a long moment, they just stared at each other, both sizing up the other. Silas could see the calculations in her gaze. She was deciding if he was friend or foe. Out here, in a world that could be cruel and unforgiving, that kind of suspicion was the only thing that kept you alive. His voice was low and steady. "I'm not with them, miss. I'm here to help." He could see her calculating his words before she nodded, ever so slightly, her trust not yet earned but given out of necessity. Silas moved closer, his rifle lowered but not forgotten. As he knelt beside her, his knife in hand, he cut the ropes that bound her wrists. His fingers brushed against her skin, feeling the warmth of her blood mingling with the rough texture of the rope. Something didn't sit right. Her hands were soft, smooth, untouched by the calluses of hard labor. This wasn't a settler's daughter, not a rancher's girl. She let out a soft groan as the ropes fell away, her legs giving out from under her. Silas caught her before she hit the ground, and that's when he saw it. Around her neck, hanging from a thin gold chain, was a locket. It was the same locket he'd seen in a painting that hung above the fireplace in his own house. The realization hit him like a punch to the gut. He knew that name. Harrison Caldwell, the man who'd supposedly died years ago, leaving his ranch to be sold off to pay for back taxes. Silas had bought this land for a song, with no questions asked. But now, standing in front of him, was the daughter of the man who had once owned it all. Her eyes met his, wide and intense. She whispered, "They killed him, and now they want to kill me." The world around Silas felt as though it had shifted on its axis, and for the first time in years, he wasn't sure which side of the line he was standing on. Silas was barely able to register her words before the sound of hooves thundered through the dry, brittle air, their rhythmic pounding like a death march echoing across the open plain. He quickly grasped the girl's arm, pulling her upright with surprising strength for her fragile state. She winced, but didn't protest. With a swift glance, Silas spotted the riders cresting the hill in the distance. 3 of them, silhouetted against the pale sky, moving like predators, methodical and patient, each one a shadow on horseback. "Garrett's men," the girl muttered, her voice a mixture of fear and hardened resolve. "They're the ones who took me." Silas glanced at her, his mind whirling. Garrett. The name was unfamiliar, but not unimportant. He could see the way the girl's body stiffened. The fear in her eyes sharpened into a desperate focus as the riders grew closer. "Why would they take you?" Silas asked quietly, his voice a low whisper, his hand still holding her arm as if to steady her against the oncoming storm. She looked at him, her eyes as fierce as the wind howling across the prairie. "They want the ranch." "But it's mine," she said, the words thick with anger. "It's mine, and they won't take it." The words hung in the air between them, heavy with the weight of her father's death and the power that now threatened to consume her. But Silas wasn't sure whether it was her strength or the quiet desperation that gripped him hardest. He knew what it meant to have something stolen. He also knew what it meant to fight for what was right. The riders, now clearly visible, were no longer galloping aimlessly. They moved with precision, closing the distance between them and the young girl like wolves encircling prey. Silas knew they'd seen the cut ropes, the sign of a struggle, and they weren't far behind. "They'll be here soon," he said, his tone grim as he scanned the land around them. "We don't have much time." The girl's gaze flicked to the riders, and then back to him. "We can't let them take me," she said, her voice steady despite the fear pulsing through her veins. "Please, Mr. Whitmore, help me. I don't care about the ranch anymore, but they'll kill me if I go back." His mind raced, conflicted. He had no real loyalty to the Caldwell family. He had bought the ranch fair and square, believing it was abandoned, left to rot by a dead man with no heirs. But now, standing next to this girl, who claimed to be Harrison Caldwell's daughter, the land he thought he had built his life on suddenly felt like a lie. The words of the girl rang in his mind. They killed him for it. The realization struck him, cold and hard. The land, the ranch, it was all built on the blood of a man Silas had never known. Behind them, the thundering of hooves grew louder. They were coming. No more time for questions. No more time for doubt. "Can you run?" Silas asked, his voice firm now, his decision made in the span of a heartbeat. The girl nodded, her body tensing. She was stronger than she looked, a testament to survival in a land that didn't forgive weakness. Without another word, Silas grabbed her under the arms, and together they stumbled toward the old oak tree, trying to keep out of sight as the riders drew closer. Silas' boots slapped the dry earth beneath him, the sun now fully risen and casting long shadows over the hills. But even the sun couldn't hide the danger that was closing in. The girl pressed herself against the rough bark of the oak, her breath shallow as the riders drew near. Silas crouched low, rifle still at his side but unused. His eyes flicked to the riders, analyzing their movements, the way they sat tall in their saddles with the confidence of men who knew they owned the land. They were coming to take what they thought was theirs. The man in the center was tall, lean, wearing a black hat that shadowed his face. The others flanked him, just as dangerous, their hands resting on their gun belts with a laziness that came from years of unchallenged power. "Why do they want you?" Silas whispered again, more to himself than to her, but she heard him. "Garrett has eyes everywhere," she said, her voice tight with urgency. "He'll stop at nothing to own this land. And now he wants me gone." Silas' chest tightened. It wasn't just a claim to land. It was about power, control. And something told him that if this girl was right, Garrett wasn't going to stop until he had everything, including her. One of the riders shouted. They had found the cut ropes. "Stay down," Silas whispered, his hand firmly gripping the girl's arm as he pulled her further behind the oak. His mind raced. There was nowhere to run, no easy way out. His rifle wouldn't save them. Not here. Not now. Then he heard it, the unmistakable crack of a branch snapping, and he knew the riders were close. The girl beside him tensed, her eyes wide with fear, but Silas held her steady. He could feel the weight of the decision ahead, a moment that would define his future. The riders were just moments away. Silas could hear their horses snorting in impatience, their riders murmuring to one another in low, guttural tones that carried on the wind like an ominous warning. His pulse quickened, but he kept his breathing steady, his gaze fixed on the dark figures as they neared the creek. The girl beside him was still, her body pressed against the tree's rough bark. Her breathing was shallow, but her eyes never left the riders. Silas could see the wild flickers of fear in her gaze. But there was something else, too. Something fierce. She wasn't going to go back, no matter what Garrett's men did. Through the scattered branches of the oak, Silas watched the leader of the riders dismount. The man in the black hat moved with a deliberate grace, like a predator surveying its kill. The other two men spread out, fanning out in search of any sign of the girl's escape. They were closing in, and Silas knew the time for hiding was running out. He couldn't let them take her. Not after everything she'd said, everything she'd revealed. But as he watched the man in the black hat kneel beside the cut ropes, it became clear this wasn't just about land. It was about control, about breaking the girl, Evangeline Caldwell, Harrison Caldwell's daughter. The realization struck him like a lightning bolt. The land Silas had thought he had earned, the ranch he had built his life upon, it wasn't his. It had never been his. Silas glanced at Evangeline. She was staring at the ground, her eyes hard and distant, her body taut as a bowstring. For the first time, he saw the full depth of her burden, the weight of her father's legacy, the cruel realization that the land she had every right to claim had been stolen from under her feet. The man in the black hat rose to his feet, brushing the dirt from his knees. He turned toward the others and shouted, "She's close. Spread out. She's here somewhere." The girl flinched, her eyes wide with terror, but she didn't move. Silas could feel the tension between them, the silent agreement that they couldn't run, not yet, not without a plan. His heart pounded as the sound of hooves grew louder, the riders closing in on their position. But then, before Silas could react, Evangeline whispered something that sent a shiver down his spine. "Do you know who I am, Mr. Whitmore?" Silas' breath caught in his throat. The words hit him like a fist to the gut. He turned slowly, his mind scrambling to piece everything together. The girl, her bloodied hands, the locket, the name that was suddenly becoming far too familiar. Harrison Caldwell. The girl's gaze met his, piercing and full of a quiet fury. "I said, do you know who I am?" she repeated, her voice gaining strength. "I'm Harrison Caldwell's daughter. And that land, my land, it's mine by birthright." The truth hit Silas harder than he could have ever imagined. The land he'd thought was his, a piece of a broken world he had worked for, struggled for, had never belonged to him at all. He'd been living on stolen land, and the girl beside him was the rightful heir. She was the key to everything, and he had been blind to it all. "Your father," Silas murmured, his voice barely above a whisper. "Harrison Caldwell. He died." Evangeline nodded, her jaw tight. "They killed him. Garrett had him killed because he wanted the ranch, wanted the water rights." Her eyes narrowed, a bitter edge in her voice. "And now he wants me. But I'll die before I let him take this from me." Silas felt the ground shift beneath him, the weight of everything he thought he knew crumbling away. He had always believed that the ranch had been abandoned, left to rot with the landowner's death. The paperwork had seemed in order, too perfect to question. But now, standing face to face with Harrison Caldwell's daughter, Silas understood. The land he thought he had bought was never his to begin with. It belonged to her. And the men coming for her, they had been hunting her not just because of the land, but because they knew she was the key to destroying everything Garrett had built. They had taken her to silence her, to erase the truth. Silas' heart sank. The choice that lay before him wasn't just about protecting a girl. It was about deciding whether he would remain complicit in the theft of her birthright, or whether he would risk everything he'd built to help her reclaim it. As the riders moved closer, their horses' hooves pounding the earth, Silas realized he didn't need to make that decision. It had already been made. The moment he'd heard her story, the moment he'd seen the fear and fury in her eyes, the decision had been taken from him. He wasn't going to let them take her. He stepped forward, placing himself squarely in front of Evangeline, his rifle still slung across his back. His gaze never left the men approaching from the creek. "We don't have time," he said quietly, his voice steady. "We need to move." Evangeline's eyes locked onto his, a flicker of surprise in them before the fierceness returned. "Where to?" she asked, her voice sharp. Silas didn't hesitate. "There's a place up north, a creek I know well. We can make it there before they do. But as they moved, trying to make their way toward the northern pass, Silas couldn't shake the feeling that they were being herded. These men were no ordinary thugs. They were calculating, ruthless, and they would stop at nothing to get what they wanted. The wind picked up, kicking dust and dry earth into the air, making it harder for Silas and Evangeline to move swiftly. Their steps were hurried, but the vast expanse of the land seemed to stretch farther than it ever had before, each step more precious than the last. Behind them, the riders were closing in, their horses' hooves thundering across the hard earth like the beat of a war drum. "We've got to move faster," Silas said, his voice grim as he glanced over his shoulder. Evangeline, though exhausted and battered, didn't slow her pace. The fire in her eyes was enough to fuel them both. The sun had risen higher now, its scorching heat casting long shadows across the land. Silas felt the sweat bead on his brow, his hands gripping Evangeline's as they made their way toward the northern pass. The land was rugged here, the rocky outcroppings and narrow paths a barrier that could delay Garrett's men, but only for so long. Silas knew they couldn't outrun them forever. As they approached the pass, the ground beneath them changed. The flat earth gave way to jagged rocks and uneven terrain, forcing them to climb and scramble over boulders. The air smelled of dry stone and old earth, the scent mingling with the sharp tang of fear that clung to both of them. Evangeline moved with surprising agility, her feet sure and steady, as if she had been born to this kind of land. Silas, struggling to keep pace, marveled at her strength. But as they neared the top of a ridge, he heard something that made his blood run cold. The sound of hoofbeats. The riders had found their trail, and they were closer than he had hoped. "Up ahead," Silas muttered, his hand pulling Evangeline into a narrow gap between two boulders. "They won't be able to follow us through here. Not unless they dismount." The gap was tight, just wide enough for them to slip through, but even then, they couldn't afford to stop. Silas led the way, keeping his body low, moving quickly but carefully. He could hear the riders now, the creaking of saddles, the rustle of leather, and the occasional shout. Garrett's men were closing in. A shout rang out from the distance, and Silas's heart leaped into his throat. They were coming for them. But there was something else, something more pressing. As they scrambled through the rocks, Silas caught sight of something ahead. A steep drop, a ravine. The ground below seemed to fall away in a sudden, unforgiving drop of at least 15 feet. The creek roared below, its icy waters rushing over smooth stones, swollen from recent rains. The ravine was too far to jump, too dangerous to cross without proper footing. Silas stopped in his tracks, his mind racing. There was no way forward. "Mr. Whitmore, what do we do now?" Evangeline's voice broke through his thoughts. There was a tremor in it now, a crack in her bravado that made Silas's chest tighten. But there was no time to comfort her. He had to make a choice. "We're not going back," Silas said firmly, his voice unwavering even as his mind scrambled for a plan. He looked around, scanning the rocky edges for a way out. He saw no easy path, no obvious escape route. But he couldn't afford hesitation. "I know the creek," Silas said. "We can make it down there." "We have to." Evangeline looked at him, her expression a mix of fear and disbelief. "It's too far," she said, her voice cracking with doubt. "It's our only chance," Silas replied, his tone hardening with resolve. "We climb down, swim across. They won't follow us into the water." The roar of the creek below them grew louder, as if to challenge his words. The wind howled through the canyon, carrying with it the scent of wet stone and danger. The men chasing them would reach the ravine soon, and Silas knew that they didn't have much time to make it down the cliffside. The narrow rocks provided only a slim path, and one wrong move could send them both tumbling to the water below. Without waiting for another word, Silas began his descent, carefully picking his way down the cliffside. His boots scraped against the rocks, his hands gripping the rough stone for balance. Evangeline followed, slower but determined. Silas could hear her breath quicken with every step she took, the tension in the air thickening as the minutes passed. The sound of Garrett's men was growing nearer, their shouts echoing off the canyon walls. They were closing in, and the only thing between them and freedom was the perilous drop to the creek. Evangeline's hand found his arm, and Silas looked up to find her face pale, her lips trembling. She was scared, but she was also strong. He could see it in her eyes. She had the same fire he had seen in her father's portrait, the same resolve. She wasn't going to die here. Keep going, he urged her, his voice firm. We're almost there. But just as they neared the last few feet, a gunshot rang out. The bullet zipped past them, narrowly missing Silas's ear. He ducked instinctively, pulling Evangeline close. The shot had come from behind them, from the ridge. They've found us, Silas muttered, a sense of urgency rising in him like a wave. The creek below them had become their only hope. If they didn't make it there, they were done. Climb faster, Silas ordered, his voice cutting through the noise. Evangeline didn't hesitate. With a fierce determination, she scrambled down the last few feet of the rock, landing with a soft thud on the ground below. Silas followed quickly, jumping down just as another shot cracked through the air, hitting the rock beside him. He felt the rush of air from the bullet as it grazed past his cheek. They were on the edge of the creek now. The water surged beneath them, cold and unforgiving. Ready? Silas asked, his heart pounding in his chest. Evangeline nodded, and without another word, they plunged into the icy current. The water hit them with a shock, the cold cutting through their clothes like 1,000 needles. Silas gasped for air, but fought to keep his head above water as the current tried to pull them downstream. Evangeline was ahead of him, her strokes strong and purposeful. Silas followed her, using the rocks to steady himself, his lungs burning with the cold, the desperate fear of being caught creeping up his spine. But they were free. The cold of the creek was sharp against Silas's skin, but it was nothing compared to the icy fear clawing at his insides. The current pulled fiercely, dragging them downstream as they fought to stay afloat, their soaked bodies struggling against the torrent. Every stroke felt like a battle, but Silas kept his eyes fixed on Evangeline, who was forging ahead with the same strength she'd shown on the rocky climb. They swam hard, pushing themselves toward the far bank, the sound of hooves and shouting fading slightly as the distance grew. Silas felt the stones scrape against his legs, his breath shallow, his lungs burning for air. Every muscle screamed in protest, but he couldn't stop. The riders wouldn't give up, and neither could he. Not for this girl. Not for the truth that had suddenly been thrust into his hands like a loaded gun. As they reached the opposite bank, Silas pulled himself out of the water first, his body heavy with exhaustion. He turned to offer a hand to Evangeline, but she had already scrambled up the embankment, her determination as fierce as ever. She didn't say anything, just nodded toward the path ahead. There was no time for words, no time to rest. They had to keep moving and fast. But as they caught their breath, the first sound Silas heard wasn't the distant pounding of hooves. It was the rumble of wagon wheels drawing near. A new set of wheels, moving urgently through the land. Evangeline froze. Silas turned sharply, his heart skipping a beat. The figure coming toward them wasn't another rider. It was a wagon, drawn by 2 tired mules, rolling steadily down a trail that led them directly to the edge of the creek. The woman driving the wagon was elderly, her face weathered from years spent under the harsh sun. Her silver hair was tied back tightly, and her posture was rigid with the kind of authority that came only from living a hard life on the frontier. Silas didn't know her, but there was something about her, something familiar in the way she moved with the practiced ease of someone who had seen too much. Evangeline Caldwell. The woman called out, her voice carrying across the distance. "Child, do you have any idea what kind of hornet's nest you've stirred up by coming back here?" Evangeline's eyes went wide with recognition, and before Silas could ask what was going on, she was already waving her arms. "Mrs. Henley, over here." Martha Henley, the woman with the mules, guided the wagon down to the creek's edge with surprising skill. When she set foot on the ground, she looked at Silas, her gaze sharp, missing nothing. "So, you're the man who's been living on Harrison's land all these years. Martha's voice was heavy with years of knowledge and experience. I wondered when this day would come. Silas felt a sudden weight settle in his chest. You knew? He asked, his voice low, not sure what to believe anymore. Martha's gaze flicked to Evangeline, then back to him. Of course I knew. Think an old woman like me wouldn't keep track of Harrison's only child. Her voice was tinged with both anger and regret. But knowing and being able to do something about it are two different things entirely. She reached into the back of the wagon and pulled out a leather satchel, handling it like it contained something precious. The sight of it made Silas's heart skip. This is why I'm here, Martha said, handing the satchel to Evangeline, her old hands trembling. When they took you, I knew it was time to stop hiding the truth. Evangeline, shaking but determined, opened the satchel. Inside was a thick document sealed with wax, the will, the real will. Silas's breath caught in his throat. His mind reeled with the implications. This was the key to everything. The truth that could destroy Garrett's grip on the land. The truth that could set Evangeline free. The document was no longer just a piece of paper. It was her inheritance, and it was the truth of her father's death. Her fingers trembled as she pulled the document free, the wax seal cracking with a satisfying snap. Evangeline's voice wavered as she began to read aloud, each word a blow to the lies Garrett had built his empire on. I, Harrison Caldwell, being of sound mind and body, do hereby leave all my earthly possessions to my beloved daughter, Evangeline Marie Caldwell. But before she could finish, the sound of hoofbeats shattered the moment. They were closer now, and they were coming fast. Silas looked toward the ridge, where the familiar figures of Garrett's men appeared once more. He knew that they had to act quickly. This moment, this truth, was slipping through their fingers like water in a dry creek bed. Evangeline's face hardened as she looked at Silas, her voice quiet but resolute. We need to get to Millbrook. They can't stop us now. But Silas knew it wasn't just the men on horseback they had to worry about. The trap they were running from had already been set. A soft laugh came from Martha Henley, dry and full of the kind of wisdom that only came from surviving long enough to see everything turn to dust. They can't stop you, child. Not now. Then, in the distance, the unmistakable figure of Garrett himself appeared, sitting motionless on a black horse, a spyglass in hand, watching them from the canyon rim. Don't worry about him, Martha said, her voice as steady as the desert wind. We've got a way out. Without warning, Martha reached into the wagon once more, pulling out something that made Silas's heart freeze. A stick of dynamite. Civilized men don't murder children, she said, her tone calm but deadly. Harrison taught me how to use these when the Apache were raiding. She lifted it high in the air, her eyes flashing with a fire that matched the sun above them. One stick will bring down enough rock to bury this whole canyon floor. Garrett's men stopped. They hesitated, and for the first time in a long while, Silas saw fear in the eyes of the men who had thought themselves untouchable. Now, Martha said with a smile, now, we finish what Harrison started. The silence that followed was thick, heavy with the weight of decisions that could either break or bind lives. Garrett's men were no longer sure of their next move. They had underestimated Martha Henley, just as they had underestimated Evangeline, just as they had underestimated Silas Whitmore. For years, they had taken for granted their position of power, thinking they could crush anyone who stood in their way. But now, standing at the mouth of that canyon with the echoes of their own fear ringing in their ears, they were realizing they were no longer the ones in control. Martha held the dynamite in her hands like it was nothing more than a tool, as if she had been born for moments like this. Her eyes never left Garrett, who sat atop his horse, his face shadowed beneath his black hat. Silas watched the man carefully, seeing the faintest flicker of uncertainty in his eyes, something rare for a man who had lived his life unchallenged. Evangeline, standing tall despite the bruises and blood staining her dress, clutched her father's will with shaking hands. The weight of it was more than just the paper it was written on. It was the truth. It was the end of a lie that had stolen not just land but lives. The life of her father, the life of this ranch, and, for too many years, her own life. Silas's hand brushed against her arm. He didn't need to say anything. She knew the truth, too. "This isn't over," Garrett called out from his place above them, his voice low but carrying through the canyon. "You think this will stop me? You think some old woman and a child with a forge can end it all?" Martha's lips curled into a smile that was both wry and bitter. "We're not the ones who are done, Garrett. You are. This land doesn't belong to you. It never did." The word struck Silas like a thunderclap. Garrett had built his empire on lies and bloodshed, and now those lies were crumbling, falling apart like dust in the wind. "You think I'll just let you walk away?" Garrett's voice cracked with barely concealed rage. His hand dropped to his gun belt, but before he could make a move, Silas stepped forward, standing tall between Evangeline and the man who had stolen everything from them. "No," Silas said quietly, his voice as hard as the canyon walls around them. "But you're going to have to go through me." Garrett's gaze flicked from Silas to the dynamite in Martha's hands, his eyes narrowing as if calculating his next move. But he knew, deep down, that he had lost. The evidence was clear. The will, the documents, the truth, in all its weight, was no longer something he could bury with his lies. "Leave," Silas said, his voice ringing with finality. "You've lost. All of it. And we're not backing down." Garrett stood silent for a moment, his expression unreadable. Then, with a sharp jerk of his head, he spurred his horse into motion, signaling his men to fall back. They hadn't expected to lose, not like this, not in the face of something as simple, as unyielding, as truth. The riders retreated, their silhouettes growing smaller as they disappeared over the ridge. Silas didn't move, watching them until they were nothing but dust on the wind. The canyon, once filled with the sound of galloping hooves and angry threats, was now quiet. Martha lowered the dynamite with a deep sigh. "That's how it's done." Evangeline, still standing strong beside Silas, finally allowed herself a breath, her shoulders relaxing ever so slightly. "It's done, then." Silas looked at her, his gaze softening. "It's just beginning. You'll rebuild this ranch, Evangeline. Your father's legacy won't be forgotten." She nodded, her eyes glistening with a mixture of grief and something else. Hope, perhaps, or the resolve to finally take control of a life that had been stolen from her. "Thank you, Mr. Whitmore," she said quietly, her voice a mix of gratitude and something deeper, more personal. The wind shifted, carrying the scent of earth and rain from the distant mountains. The day felt different now. The weight of the past lifted just a little, replaced by the promise of a future built on honesty, sweat, and determination. As Silas looked over the land, the sprawling ranch that had once been a symbol of his own hidden guilt, he realized something he hadn't allowed himself to acknowledge before. This was where he belonged, not just because the land was his, but because he had fought for it. Not with bullets or lies, but with truth. And now, Evangeline would take her place as its rightful owner. The canyon echoed with the last remnants of a struggle, but in the quiet that followed, a new chapter began. Silas and Evangeline stood side by side, watching the sun dip low behind the hills, casting the world in a golden light. In the Old West, redemption was often earned in blood, but here, under the endless sky, it was earned with truth. "Some debts aren't paid in gold," Silas said softly, his voice carrying the weight of the past. "They're paid in blood." And in that moment, both he and Evangeline knew that justice, in the end, had been served.